Welcome, everybody. This is going to be a podcast on how to interpret Scripture. It's going to be a little tongue-in-cheek and hopefully has a little bit of humor in it. My name is Jeffrey Taylor, and I'll be your host for this podcast. This podcast is about scriptural exegesis, or how to study Scripture. It's going to be, in particular, looking at a very specific Scripture on the tragic fall of Humpty Dumpty. So let's get started. The Bible, or for that matter, any religious scripture, can be a bit irritating. This is not because of content, but because of interpretation. A rabbi once told me that good scripture is written to be intentionally vague. This allows the text to be freshly interpreted and still be relevant over thousands of years and through various cultures. Good scripture generates a multitude of diverse interpretations, all of which can be meaningful and appropriate. As such, scripture can be used for comfort, wisdom, enlightenment, self-realization of God, and wisdom for the greater good of both individuals and humanity. However, scripture can also be weaponized to justify practices that result in hurt, anguish, political justification of dubious policies, self-doubt, mind control, murder, and even generate wars. At this point, let's talk about a word: exegesis. It's what all the biblical scholars call studying the scriptures and attempting to interpret them. Exegesis is defined as the critical interpretation of the scriptural text to discover its intended meaning, the science of interpretive principles. The opposite of exegesis actually means to draw out. The opposite of it is eisegesis, which means to draw in. This is the injection of purely subjective interpretations into the text, unsupported by the text itself. In scholarly circles, eisegesis is often used as a derogatory term. It turns out that eisegesis is what most common people do whenever they attempt to interpret Scripture. After all, anyone can open a Bible, start reading, and understand the teachings of Jesus and Christianity, right? Well, you would think so. We even give Bibles to children in the 6th grade, who then go off and probably put it on a shelf somewhere and never opened it up, but that's another point. After all, it's pretty simple and straightforward. Anyone can open a Bible, start reading, and understand the teachings of Jesus and Christianity, right? After all, it's pretty simple and straightforward. Well, let's stop and think about this. The New Testament is a collection of books composed by different anonymous authors over about a 200-year period. A few of these books, 27 of them to be exact, were eventually selected by a council of men to be canonized into what we call the New Testament. Many of the rest were declared heretical and destroyed. During the 300-year gestation period of the New Testament, a lot of extraneous material, basically tradition and myth, made its way into the editing of the New Testament canon. John Wesley, the founder of modern-day Methodism, understood that the interpretation of something as complex as the Bible required more than just a simple reading of the text. He formulated what is now known as the Wesley Quadrilateral for the theological interpretation, otherwise known as exegesis. Wesley believed that the living core of the Christian faith was revealed in Scripture, illuminated by history, also called tradition, vivified in personal experience, and confirmed by reason. Accumulated tradition and personal experiences over 2,000 years can change the intended meaning of any scriptural passage. In addition, cultural norms change over time such that most scripture needs to be reinterpreted in light of the current culture. Wesley could never have anticipated, back in the 1700s, interpretation controversies such as the current LGBTQ+ issues. That is why reason is the final pillar for the theological interpretation, as well as Wesley's admonition to do no harm. So for this podcast, we're going to take a very simple scripture that everybody knows regarding the tragic fall of Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty is one of the best known and most popular in the English language. The most common modern text is, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. So this brings us to a little dialogue between a teacher and his student about how to interpret Humpty Dumpty. You wouldn't think it would be too difficult. The teacher starts out by saying, "What does the text tell us?" Student looks at him and says, "That Mr. Dumpty was sitting on a wall, lost his balance, fell a considerable distance to the ground, where he broke apart and was unable to be repaired." Teacher looks at the student. "Excellent. But why couldn't he be repaired?" The student, "Because he was an egg. And when an egg breaks, it's not easy to put everything back inside and glue the eggshell back together. In addition, the first responders were horses that didn't have any fingers and king's men of dubious dexterity." Teacher looks at the student with a little bit of shock. "Egg? What egg? The text says nothing about Mr. Dumpty being an egg. Besides, an egg could not possibly sit on a wall. They're rounded and would roll right off." Student now is getting a little bit miffed. "You're a teacher and don't know that Humpty Dumpty was an egg? Everybody knows that. It's common knowledge. What a stupid statement." The teacher responds, "You need to focus on the question asked and the content of the text. You are bringing in extraneous legendary content that is not supported by the text. When doing exegetical analysis, one needs to consider only the information in the supplied text." The student, "Hey, all my life I have known this rhyme, and there was never any doubt that Humpty Dumpty was an egg. I'm comfortable with the idea that he's an egg. Why do teachers have to come along and question stuff with all their analysis?" Teacher responds, "I just want to know where you got the idea that Humpty Dumpty is an egg." The student, "Because it's all the pictures. So whoever drew the first picture must have known the guy who wrote the rhyme, or he'd never have drawn Humpty Dumpty as an egg. After all, once it's written down or drawn in a book, it's got to be real, right? Oh, the trials of being a teacher." Well, Humpty Dumpty and the missing egg go to the heart of our situation. Our traditions and myths become fixed. They provide the lens through which everything is viewed. It becomes common knowledge or common sense. Let's dig a little deeper into our nursery rhyme example and see what we can find. The rhyme probably started out as a simple oral song long before it was committed to pen and paper. The earliest known written version was published in Samuel Arnold's Juvenile Amusements in 1797. Here are the lyrics. "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. 80 men and 80 more could not make Humpty Dumpty where he was before." No mention of Humpty being broken in the fall, just changed. Nothing here in the first written edition to indicate, even tangentially, that Humpty is a broken egg. A manuscript addition to a copy of Mother Goose's Melody, published in 1803, has a version of the rhyme with a different last line. The last line is, "Could not set Humpty Dumpty up again." It was published in 1810 in a version of Gamer Guten's Garlandus, whatever that is. Here's the whole rhyme. "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. 80 men and 80 more cannot place Humpty Dumpty as he was before." Now, in deference to our above student's comment about the first picture showing Humpty Dumpty as an egg, the first published picture of Humpty Dumpty, and he is not an egg. An illustration from Walter Crane's Mother Goose's Nursery Rhymes, published in 1877, shows Humpty Dumpty as a boy. So much for accurate folklore being common sense. The first picture of Humpty, accompanied by the lyrics to the rhyme and some music, looks like a rag doll sitting on a wall. However, the book that really put Humpty Dumpty on the wall as an egg was Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, published in 1872, where he discusses semantics and pragmatics with Alice. Carroll makes Humpty a breakable egg to liven up the satirical dialogue. Here's Humpty Dumpty's dialogue with Alice, and I quote, "I don't know what you mean by glory," Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't, till I tell you. I mean, there's a nice knockdown argument for you." "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument," Alice objected. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said, in rather a scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more or less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which is to be master, that's all." Alice was too much puzzled to say anything, so after a minute, Humpty Dumpty began again. "They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot." Accompanying in this book, that dialogue, there's a picture of Alice standing below Humpty Dumpty on a wall, and Humpty Dumpty is indeed pictured as an egg. This picture, Humpty Dumpty and Alice, illustrated by John Tennell from a later edition of Through the Looking Glass. So now Humpty is firmly ensconced in tradition as an egg on a wall, thanks to mass production of published books. Today we have managed to push Humpty over the top into a fully rehabilitated egg. TurboTax, a U.S. tax preparation software firm owned by Intuit, ran a Humpty Dumpty-inspired television commercial during the 2017 Super Bowl. The ad depicted Humpty Dumpty in a hospital using a smartphone application to ask whether he could claim a tax deduction for medical expenses. It would seem that the twin pillars of 21st century American culture, healthcare and the tax code, have given Humpty a new lease on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, thereby turning the rhyme on its head. Apparently, nothing is sacred to an American consumer. One example, and we can now see how folklore, tradition, and myth can run wild to define what common sense includes. Is there any wonder why Wesley needed to include both history and reason into the mix? Not only does biblical scripture have 2,000 years of changing tradition and folklore built into its interpretation, we also have the added issue of language. Jesus, or to call him by his real name, Yeshua, a form of Joshua, spoke and taught his disciples in his native language of Aramaic, a local language similar to Hebrew. Any oral or early written collection of his teachings would have been in Aramaic, but none have been known to survive, except perhaps the Gospel of Thomas, where recent scholarship into the extant Greek and Coptic versions have uncovered an early Aramaic core of about 40% of the text could possibly date back to the 1st century CE. Jesus' Aramaic teachings were most likely translated into Greek, the common language of international communication at the time. Some important scriptures survived only in languages such as Coptic, Latin, Syriac, and others. We read them in translated English. Today, there is a huge industry for translating the Bible into understandable modern English. Each translation puts its own theological spin and traditional baggage into the text. So when you sit down to contemplate a particular Bible passage, be aware that reason, as well as some knowledge of history and Jewish culture, may be necessary to fully evaluate the text. As Yeshua would no doubt say, "For those that have ears to hear, let them hear." Thank you again for listening to this podcast.